Good evening and welcome. My name is Amina Mankad. I am the co-chair of the Planning Alumni Committee with Michael over there, who's also my colleague, and we are very happy to welcome you tonight. It's really great to see so many familiar faces. It's also amazing to celebrate this special occasion with all of the alumni, at least present. We were very happy to have the alumni free tonight because we wanted it to be a celebration, a reunion, and I'm so glad to see so many of you tonight. Before I get started, I'm just going to get us started with the land acknowledgement. We wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. But beyond the land acknowledgement, as planners, and most of us I think in the room are, or planning adjacent, recognize that reconciliation is a fundamental component to building resilient communities. We also, as planners and planning adjacent specialists, we also acknowledge that we continue to work with colonial documents based on colonial practices. So every day we are trying, slowly but surely, to decolonize our practices through meaningful listening, learning, and sometimes unlearning, to reflect and then act. And I certainly hope that tonight, through the panel discussion that we are about to have, we can all learn more ways to grow some new roots in planning based on reconciliation, equitable thinking, and shared knowledge. But before I get to that panel discussion and the exciting questions that will be answered, I'd like you to meet a very important member of the Planning Alumni Committee. I would like you to meet one of the founding chairs of the Planning Alumni Committee 30 years ago. Please welcome Catherine Seepley.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks very much, Amina. I didn't need glasses the first time I did this gig, so now I do. Anyway, good evening. It's such a pleasure to see so many supporters here of the U of T Planning Program and Friends of Planning at this milestone event for PAC. It is the PAC 30th anniversary of this event, and 96, 97 is when we started, so it's sort of arguable whether it's this year or last year, but in any case, welcome to the 30th planning event for PAC. I'm truly honored to be this year's recipient of the PAC Honorary Chair Award, and thank you so much to the PAC Committee for this recognition. I'll keep my comments brief because I know there's an interesting program planned and lots more to come this evening, but I did want to take a moment to share some brief reflections on the establishment of PAC and some of the early days for the Planning Alumni Committee. Although I brought forward the suggestion to have a Planning Alumni Committee to the department, it was not a job that I did on my own. There were a number of members of that founding committee. I'm not sure if any of them are here tonight, but I just wanted to name who the members were of that first committee back in 1996. Thelma G. Is Thelma here tonight by any chance? No, I saw Thelma's name tag. Thelma G., Joe Guzzi, Jeff McElroy, Nancy Mudrinick, and Michael Scully. So thank you to all of the founding members who were part of that team. The idea to establish a PAC committee back in 1996 was championed by two key faculty members in the department. Professor Larry Bourne was the director of the planning program at the time, and Professor Carl Amrine was the chair of the department. And without their support, we could not have made this happen. PAC was established primarily for the purpose of forging connections among alumni, planning students, faculty, and other industry professionals, and to raise funds for a newly established first-year planning scholarship. As a means to accomplish this, the first Planning Alumni Open House was held at the Croft Chapter House here on the University College campus in March of 1997. And it's actually remained a very nice feature of this event that it continues to be hosted on the university campus. And the great room here at Hart House, I think you'll all agree, has been an excellent venue for this event. The theme of the first event was Planning the U of T District Alternative Futures, with presentations from Judy Matthews, Peter Walker, and Professor Alan Waterhouse. I'm sure a few of you in this room were there at the first event and recall it fondly. The event was a great success, and it attracted over 150 participants at the first alumni open house and raised $75,000 for the Planning Student Scholarship, which included matching grants from the university and from the province. It was always hoped that the open house, which ultimately became the Friends of Planning Spring Social, would become an annual must-attend industry event, and I think it certainly has. With a successful first event and increasing momentum, PAC began to contribute on a broader scale to the planning community here at U of T. PAC's activities and reach have expanded significantly over the past 3 decades, and in addition to scholarships, includes supporting the annual student field trip, which I know is a huge highlight of the program, as well as mentorship programs, workshops, and other student learning activities. It's very rewarding to see the legacy that's been created and fostered by PAC and by Friends of Planning, and I'm sure I share this sentiment with many others. So congratulations to the Planning Alumni Committee and the PAC Spring Social on its 30-year celebration, and thank you to everyone who's provided support over the years in numerous ways to U of T, to Friends of Planning, and to the program. I look forward to all the amazing things that the U of T Planning Program and PAC will accomplish together in the coming years. Thank you, everyone, and enjoy the evening tonight.
Thanks so much, Catherine. It really is a pleasure to see PAC go on and on strong for 30 years. And tonight we'd like to see and imagine a little bit what the next 30 years would look like. What could we as planning practitioners and practitioners as a whole bring to the practice, especially in times where there are a lot of challenges. So tonight we have a really good lineup that hopefully will delve into some of those questions, and we have different perspectives that we would love to learn from. As I said, our panel is a diverse panel that is moderated by somebody who's very dear to many. We are very happy to have the talented producer and founder of About Here, Uytae Lee, to be our moderator for tonight. Uytae created studio and YouTube channels dedicated to helping people understand their cities better. He also, in addition to his video work, is an adjunct professor at the UBC School of Journalism and a commissioner on the board of BC Housing. Please welcome Uytae Lee.
Thank you so much. Wow, I'm a dear member here, apparently. Thank you for having me, U of T. It's an honor to join you tonight. It's an honor to be in Hogwarts. I've always wanted to give a talk in a place as cool as this. Oh wow, I feel there's so much reverb in this room. I feel like everything I say has so much importance. I could say like socks, and it just like echoes. Anywho, yes, if you may have guessed by now, I have a bit of a confession to make. I did not go to U of T. I went to Dalhousie. Shout out to the East Coast. Oh, thank you. Maybe some Halifax fans in the audience as well. I had a brief chance to meet some of your alumni last night over dinner, and I got to tell you, it's really telling by just how many people are in this room. There's such a strong community of peers coming out of your program, and the fact that a group like this has lasted, survived over 30 years with hopefully minimal drama is just a testament to how tight-knit that community is. And I hope on a night like tonight, like any good reunion, I hope you are just reminded of that community. I hope you're reminded of how far you've come and of course, how old you are. Okay, so tonight's, or the series theme, I've been told, is Growing New Roots in Planning, how to build the next 30 years. And if I understand correctly, tonight is the 30-year anniversary of the PAC. I love it. I thought 30 years was an interesting number to me. You know, I get nerdy about this stuff. According to provincial policy here, municipalities are required to create official plans that plan for a 20 to 30-year horizon. So tonight's theme is really at the upper end of that time frame. And for me, I think 30 years is really a time frame where assumptions start to break down, where known unknowns become unknown unknowns. So I want to set the stage tonight properly. Tonight is not a night for talking about what height restrictions we should change, what zoning bylaws we need to adjust, about what is the right level of land lift we should capture in a rezoning. No, I want tonight to be about foundational shifts in how this profession thinks about its work and about the world and the cities around it. But to set the stage, I thought I could offer a bit of a reminder of the last 30 years and to kind of show and demonstrate that planning has been through upheavals in its thinking and its philosophies before. I actually think planning is one of those, one of the few professions where it does feel like every 30 years, the profession adopts a whole new philosophy that kind of is to fix the mistakes of the previous generation's philosophies, and it creates a lot of strife and drama, but that's a whole other topic for another time. But here's a few that came to mind for me as I was preparing for this panel. 30 years ago, in 1993, the first Congress for New Urbanism is hosted in Alexandria, Virginia, by members such as Andres Duaney, Elizabeth Plater-Syberg. Maybe you guys are familiar with these names. But basically, that group sort of, I guess, charts out the groundwork for this sort of idea of, mixing uses and creating walkable communities. I mean, that is one of the foundational moments of the last 30 years, if you ask me. In 1993, Peter Calthorpe publishes The New American Metropolis, a book that formally establishes the concept of transit-oriented developments. 30 years later, I feel like that's had a bit of an impact. This one is a little bit outside of the bounds of 30 years, but in 1983, height and density bonusing formally becomes recognized in the Ontario Planning Act, now forms Section 37. I think that might have been a pretty monumental decision. Maybe. Oh God. Okay, I'm sorry. I'm hearing some groans. I thought this was my kind of crowd. Aren't you guys nerds? All right, fine. Here's a lighter one. 2005, the establishment of the Ontario Greenbelt. Ooh, very fun, very controversial. I mean, would anyone else like to throw out some other groundbreaking, formative moments in planning? Okay, well, those are the last 30 years that came to mind for me. But I also feel like there are deeper roots, of course, that form a lot of urban planning thinking today. Sort of in the post-war era of the 1940s and 50s when cities were facing bankruptcies, the idea of growth pays for growth, that new developments should pay for the services that they consume. I think that was a formative moment. I mean, of course, the invention of zoning bylaws itself in the early 1900s. This is one that I kind of sort of have a lot of feelings about, but in 1872, the Dominions Land Act that gave free land for people who settled it for a few years and really established the kind of idea and promise that if you come to North America, you can own land. It might be, maybe forcibly taken from an indigenous group, but it's yours now, right? These are all, like for me, okay, maybe I went a little bit too far there, but too far back in history, that is. The Dominions Land Act went very too far in its own way, but what I hope I can just sort of demonstrate with that is that all of these foundational ideas that perhaps we take for granted today in urban planning were at some point in time just that, ideas, formed by people like us. And so tonight, as we think about the next 30 years, I hope we can have a conversation about what are the new seeds we want to plant that develop the new roots of urban planning over the next 30, 50, 100 years. And perhaps what are the roots that we see today that we need to maybe re-examine, that are maybe weeds that we have to sort of, uproot. This gardening analogy has its limits, but yeah, that's kind of the vibe I want to start this whole thing off with. And I got to tell you, I think we have a very capable panel for answering some of those questions. How's that for a segue? Should I move over here now as we introduce our panelists? Okay, so let me invade your personal bubble here a bit. Okay, so I feel like any planning conference, you got to have, a consultant, right? Those are the groups that usually pay for events like this. Developer, of course, someone who works in government, maybe a politician, maybe somebody in advocacy. Well, I think you'll find that the committee has selected for you today a group that I think is sort of a twist on all of those characters, all of those sort of perspectives. Yes, it'll be very interesting. People that will understand each of those perspectives, but bring sort of a radical new way of thinking about them. So without further ado, perhaps I can get into some introductions. Alrighty, I'm just going to choose at random here, whoever I've put first on my notes app. First, we have Narmadha Rajakumar, who is a partner at SHS. Sorry, that's a bit of a tongue twister. SHS is a consulting firm that works on housing for anyone who is not in the private sector. So that includes governments, nonprofits, and other organizations working to provide housing outside of the private model of development. Can we give them a round of applause and a welcome? Yeah. Okay. Next up, I want to call up Jonah Gonzales, who is an elected Squamish Nation councillor. And I think, so we've got our politician box checked off a little bit. and you'll find he is about as charismatic and affable as any politician would be. But also, interestingly enough, the Squamish Nation has recently been doing some development work out in my hometown of Vancouver. And I hope he'll have a chance to talk to us about that. The project of Sanok, the Jericho lands, Heatherlands, all that. Can we please give a warm welcome to Jonah Gonzales? Okay. Next, we have a government employee, a bureaucratic shill. I'm kidding. John Dunlop, who is the manager of Indigenous Relations, Culture, and Heritage Planning at the City of Mississauga. Can we give him a warm welcome? And last but not least, we have Chiyi Tam, who is a community organizer and the managing director and co-founder of the Toronto Chinatown Land Trust. Can we give them a warm welcome as well? I know, there's so many people, and like the reverb, you just hear yourself talk the whole time. Anyways, the Avengers have assembled. Thank you so much for joining us, me, this crowd, this room. Yeah, shall we get to talking? Let's have a conversation here. No pressure, by the way. You're responsible for, telling us what the next 30 years of planning are going to look like, and it will be documented very visually. You know what? Sorry. Quick break. Shout out to the artists of tonight, the people that are making this, helping with retention, keeping your interest. I am going to I'm sort of like, how will they translate urban planning jargon into an image? How do you put like a rezoning application down on paper? Oh, okay. Rezonings are off the table. Maybe I can throw out a fun word, like pickles. Let's throw a pickle on there somewhere. No, okay, yeah, don't. Sorry, I should stop. This is why I'm paid to moderate and not actually offer any insights. Okay, let's get to it. So, the theme of tonight is new routes for urban planning, and I like this analogy. We're kind of growing the new garden of the urban planning profession in the future. So with that, just a super broad question, what are some of the seeds you want to plant? What are you thinking about right now that would be relevant in the next 30 years of our profession? What does new routes for urban planning mean to you? Who would like to start? I feel like, Jonah, you have been voluntold for this.
This is working. Okay, awesome. So I feel like in terms of that subject, a lot of it has to do with reconciliation in my eyes, especially being in this political space. I'm from the West Coast, so Sorry, everyone.
Sorry.
Yeah, sorry.
You're welcome.
Yeah, thank you so much. But yeah, I feel like the first step of this is reconciling and understanding where we are today. You know, it's very important that we recognize and move forward in the right way and work together and not against each other. And making that first step is our priority. And I feel like John has a lot to say about this also from our talks earlier.
I feel like that's a call to talk,
Missing a mic.
John.
Well, thank you. And I will say I'm a U of T grad, but in the anthropology department, not in the planning department. So please don't boo me off stage. But when Jonah talks about that, I think about a couple of years ago when the city of Mississauga was having to do this thing called an official plan, which I think you mentioned in your introduction. And we were dealing with some new requirements that shouldn't have been new, but they were, and having to actually engage, consult, work with the indigenous peoples who hold rights within the city. And so we went down to reserves, met with a whole variety of groups, a whole variety of individuals. And there was one moment that's always stuck out in my mind when we were down at the Six Nations of the Grand River, First Nation, and the representatives from the nation asked the planning team that I was there with, and I just got to facilitate and moderate these conversations. And they said, have you ever considered the biome in the soil when you're clearing it out to make way for development? And I felt like it was this real ground shift in the thinking, because no, you know, when you're reviewing the grading plans and doing all these technical things, you're not thinking about the inherent sterilization that occurs. You're working through all the technical processes so that you can get to a yes on a planning application. And it was a great moment because it allowed that alternate perspective just for a minute, just to say, the ask isn't change the way planning happens, change the way you think about the land and so forth, but allow for that alternate perspective to be heard. Listen to the people that have been living on this land for thousands of years, hear their concerns. How are you going to integrate that perspective? And that has always stuck with me, and it's something I think about on a near daily basis when I'm looking at any of the work that's happening in the city, is saying, so their concern is on the biome, the microorganisms that exist in the soil. And so how do we make that right? How do we make that right? How do you build a city while thinking about literally the smallest part of life that can exist?
A more holistic view of how we built the city. Yeah, at all scales.
Very hard to follow you too. Also, like all of us in the room were cringing at your introduction when you were talking about the Greenbelt and Section 37, because you're not from Ontario and you don't know that we don't have those things anymore. So that's what's happened and transpired in 30 years, Uytae.
Oh my God, I'm sorry. I'm just such a newbie.
No, it's like a moment of grief that currently our whole sector is going through. Like we are an industry, a professionalized group of people that is given a mandate to interpret and create practical interpretations of very bold imaginations and direction from political discourse, from hypothetically civic processes. And yeah, if the winds can change to such extreme degrees, it really is like the rearing head of fascism is coming for all of us, genuinely. I'm planting the seed of, I do think the true North Star is land back. And I think a lot of people that work in real estate development and urban planning, who especially are not Indigenous, obviously like a lot of us don't have a chance to really sit with and think about what that as a civic discourse would prompt us to practically imagine into policy, into tools, into actual interpretation, into site rationales. But the funnest thing about working in the community land trust sector is that we are starting to be able to do that work and use all of the nerdy planning skills that we came so hopeful to learn to genuinely build better cities. We were talking about SimCity a lot as a game last night at dinner, and my father also, I'm in a rare position where my father was also an urban planner, and I knew what an urban planner was before the age of 5, which I think is rare because most people haven't heard of us. But in that, you come to want to be a part of the planning industry from very earnest ideals. That has always been true for me and people in my family. It's also true with all of the students I've ever taught here in this program at U of T. And then it just feels like we've accepted that the status quo is that inevitably you have to become much less inspired, far less aspirational to your values and your goals as like a multidimensional human being with all of your unique culture and identity and lineages and stories that you come with, because the whole curriculum and industry makes you feel somehow like we are in the best position, I would say, in terms of the knowledge and skills we have, to interpret what would, practically speaking, from attacking of all fronts, truly reconciliation and beyond reconciliation land back look like for all of us in every corner of Turtle Island, not just even specifically to, I guess, our specific neighborhood context in Chinatown. So it's been fun. Like, we have shockingly debuted an anti-colonial development framework, and people sometimes will ask us, what do you mean? Are you guys an indigenous organization? And we're like, no, we're not. We just have shared values around our project, and that's a really clear planning directive that my members and constituents have given us, which then lets me do policy development work, which is so fascinating and imaginative of, okay, then what is the appropriate amount of respect to acknowledge that we're not an indigenous-led project while still genuinely furthering the overall movement objectives and goals to make that impossible to imagine thing possible. If we couldn't imagine that mixed use could have been possible 30 years ago, and people were like, you're talking about a pipe dream, and then people sat with the problem long enough to be like, okay, but if we broke it down and actually imagined the practical step-by-step of it, what would it look like? That's the funnest seed to plant. Like 30 years ago was also the Oka crisis. And we were like on the front lines defending the golf course, like Mohawk and Six Nations. And we don't learn about that growing up in the West Coast. Sorry, Uytae and I have known each other for some time from Vancouver.
What was the Oka crisis?
Oh God.
Oh, sorry. Am I opening up a can
I'm
of
not the
worms?
right
Never
person to
mind.
tell you. That's a whole documentary that you have to watch.
That's fair. Yeah, right. Yeah,
and there's a gap in our a gap in our
There's
educational
a lot of gaps
system.
I have tonight. That's fair.
But yeah, that's where I would go, and I would be curious to throw it back to you guys.
Yeah.
Just as a, can we get
I should
Narm's
say,
mic on,
to
please?
segue for Narm to turn on her mic, this anti-colonial development framework we're actually doing, and we've hired SHS as our consultants on this innovation lab. So it's also fun to be in a position where it's like, 5 years ago, people didn't even know what a community land trust is, and now I'm in a position where I'm hiring planning consultants to get to do this imagination work.
Yeah.
Here, I will.
Yeah, you know you've made it mainstream when consulting firms offer your
Thank you for
work
the plug,
as a
Chiyi.
practice. Yeah. Yeah, shout out SHS.
No, but I think your point about shared values is really important, because when I think about reconciliation, I think about, the growing new roots in planning. It's not necessarily new roots that we need to grow, but going back to the original roots. So much of what formed, the original kind of planning principles are based on actual indigenous principles. Like, for example, sustainability is based on the 7-generation concept. And there's so much of this that has been forgotten through, the colonialization and the formation of this, patriarchal-based planning process and profession that we're in now. So I think thinking about going back to those original roots is really important. And for someone who works in the affordable housing space too, what's really important to us is thinking about housing as a right, as a fundamental human right, and being part of one of those original roots. And that kind of involves, what are we going to look like in 30 years, where we think of housing as something that everyone deserves to have, and not as an investment, or some looking at growth versus ensuring shelter for everybody. So thinking about how we can infuse housing as a human right is something that we think about a lot in our work, and ensuring that that's something that we can achieve through the shifting of the focus. And I think there's a lot of that ties into reconciliation as well, in terms of having that ownership of the land and the original ownership of the land.
Fantastic. Oh, Jonah, did you want to add something real quick there?
Yeah, I was just going to say, she stole my spotlight there about growing new roots. It's, again, I love the dialogue here, and it's amazing seeing different aspects in these areas. And I fully agree, it's not about growing new roots. It's about going back to the original ones and revitalizing those and understanding the truths behind that. You know, it's a very positive thing that we are pushing towards truth and reconciliation, and I really hope for my future generations that we continue to do such. You know, and in my role politically, we think of 7 generations ahead. So when we do our planning, we're not thinking about, I don't know, feet and zoning. We think about how it's going to positively affect our people in 7 generations. So I really appreciate what you said. It's amazing to see that that aspect coming from you. It's amazing. Thank you.
John, yeah.
I think as well, and at the very, very beginning, there was a slide up talking about the firekeepers taking care of the Glen Stewart Ravine. And you may have seen in the news, if you're local to Toronto, that the city ran its annual traditional burn in Hyde Park. And if you're not aware, it's an Indigenous practice about how they tended the land, how they tended the forest, how they effectively did a version of conservation, stewardship, planning, whatever terminology you want to call it. You know, it's a big misconception that didn't take place. I've been an archaeologist for 30 years. I've had the privilege of working on a lot of Indigenous archaeological sites, and I can tell you the level of urban complexity in a 400 or 1,000-year-old village rivals that you're going to see in a lot of cities. They had sewage management systems, they had waste disposal centers, they had care, thought, and practice put into where they built what, how, and why. And it's part of human existence. You can look back as far as people have been building anywhere in the world, and there's been planning as a part of that. But just in listening to folks talk about the roots, I think we look to the burn practices and so forth and say it's both the new roots and the old roots. It's that tending to the natural world in the way of taking care of all the roots within the forest. You have to burn away some of the old, some of the fallow, in order to allow those new roots to thrive. But you don't remove the old in order to do that. And I think that's a big part of a lot of the work that's happening now in terms of reconciliation, is that refusal to remove the old while still allowing the new.
Well, thank you so much for these initial seeds of thoughts. You guys, the theme of reconciliation has come up multiple times just right now, and I think that is an appropriate one to highlight as a big topic of discussion for the next several decades of urban planning. And it's one that's been on my mind because I feel like just in the, even in the last few years, I feel like there's been a shift in the tone of what reconciliation means. I mean, I'm sure we've all heard of a land acknowledgement. We've all seen some of the lip service that's been given to reconciliation, the good vibes around it. I feel like in the last few years, I've seen real brass tacks start to emerge around what that might look like on the ground. And I'll reference things, of course, like the Sanok development that your nation is developing right now. Jonah, a round of applause for that. We got some fans. I believe they are accepting rental applications. If anyone does, if you're a fan, I mean, that's one way you could demonstrate it. But also perhaps more controversially, the Cowichan land decision recently in BC that involved fee simple land. And so I think it's definitely become a hot topic of discourse and planning. And so I was curious for this panel, but maybe if you don't mind me starting with you, Jonah, like what does meaningful reconciliation look like in your perspective? And if you don't mind speaking a little bit more about Sanok, perhaps for those of us who are not as familiar with the project in the room, how do you see and how does your nation see projects like that within the broader discourse around reconciliation?
Yeah, that's a really, really big topic. But just to jump back in history a little bit, Sanok or Snouth is on our Kitsilano lands, and it's a project with multiple phases. We're bringing up multiple towers to house our peoples and to help with provincially requested homes, rental units. So actually, first tower is actually up and people are moving in June. So I'm really, really excited for that. So we have about 1,406 homes. I believe 20% of that are affordable, which is amazing. But just to go back in history, Kitsilano was one of our prime areas. We had one of our biggest longhouses there. that's where people up and down the coast would all come and meet and to trade or to practice ceremony. And back in 1903, actually, it got taken away from us. We got pushed aside. 1923, we actually amalgamated the Squamish peoples, 16 villages, 16 chiefs. So we amalgamated in 1923, and then here we are today. We had a long legal battle for about, I think it was 30 years for Kitsilano, and we got it back in 2003. So it's been a while. It's been a lot of work and process, and I really put my hands up, and I thank my previous counselors that were here before me that carried on the good work that they're doing. But the end-all goal is to just, like I said in our talks earlier too, is to carry on with generations ahead, look forward. It's not just about me now, it's about my children, my grandchildren in the future. How are they gonna have economic prosperity? How are they gonna have homes? How are we gonna be seen? You know, I feel like the biggest thing is informed consent. That's the biggest thing, is understanding and to having relationships. And what I think is amazing is that when we go to the province or when we go to the feds or just the government in general, we come with solutions and not problems. And I understand with zoning, it's a little bit different on our end, but I'd like to hear what you guys have to say about that. If you guys know much about Sanak?
We do speak about it a lot in the recent graduate programming, but if people graduated before Sanak was proposed, they probably don't know, like in the room. But the planning consultants for Sanak are Urban Strategy, which is based here in Toronto. So I do think many people in the sector would have heard that they were working on that file, and like the sort of predominantly white institutional media frenzy around it did come with a lot of criticism, which I've been really curious what that felt like inside of the pressure cooker of the deliberative process internally in the nation. Because I really, from afar, from over here in Toronto, we really watched with great admiration how you all handled the incredible media scrutiny and negative reactionary backlash to, oh my God, like Squamish Nation is partnering with West Bank, RIP West Bank, and building giant towers in the center, like on the beach waterfront, blah blah blah, and that, you know, you guys have absolute rights to do that, and to be that bold and daring and imaginative, but also to be so explicit about community wealth building, because at the end of the day, like, I think the shift in reconciliation that we will be looking forward to, that I'm really looking forward to, is like a hard conversation about the material economics that is implied in land ownership and land regulation and the speculative value of that. And to acknowledge that if you control and own the property rights, which is different than land, and understanding the difference between land and property, if we are the profession that regulates and invents and creates the boundaries and rules around the concept of property, then it lets us be the best positioned to wield that as a tool to unpack what does it look like to redistribute those 5 property rights that we teach about in Urban Planning 101, and think about building community wealth, which I just feel like, again, we all really admire, not just Squamish Nation, but also the group of families in Tsleil-Waututh and Musqueam over here, because our provincial context over here has not afforded us, because of such a different colonization and settlement history, to reference the Dominion Lands Act, opportunities to really explore that really bold, imaginative work. So it's both deep concern and curiosity, but also like, wow, super kudos to you guys. But what was it like, if you're willing to speak on it, of how you guys stayed so calm and gentle in the reaction?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like, again, my hands go up to my previous counselors that did have to deal with a major push on actually activating it. But yes, there is a lot of public scrutiny about it. But I see both sides. You know, I see the area where it's like, this was our home. You know, this is where our people gathered, and it was taken away for over 100 years. How much does that really cost? You know, like, that's how I feel from the more grounding level. And when I think about that, it's the same when you think of just prime real estate areas. And it's Vancouver. There's hundreds of towers up, and then what happens? A new group comes in and wants to build towers for their people. You know, I see areas with that where it kind of is disheartening because we're all humans, right? So being the first peoples there, we want to have something too. We want to be able to live in society. We want to be able to contribute to society in the correct way. And I don't know if you guys have seen Sanok, but it's absolutely beautiful. The biggest thing around it is it being transit orientated, which is amazing. And so I'd really strongly advise you to look into it. But again, speaking on the public scrutiny side, it gets hard, but you know, we're on the end phases of it, and obviously in politics there's going to be the naysayers, there's going to be people who support you, there's going to be people who don't support you, and I think of it as a very positive thing. We're bringing homes, we're bringing in affordability, you know, we're creating jobs, so that's how I see it personally. Yeah.
Fascinating. You know, I'm hearing some interesting themes emerge. If you don't mind me, I like to do this to like here's what I'm hearing. You know, what I'm hearing is it's you know, for a project like Sanok, it's a mixture of agency for the nation in building a project that will generate wealth, and it will give you resources to further help and support your own population. But on the flip side, it's also, you're leaving quite literally an imprint in Vancouver, and in a way it's actually, you know, contributing to the urban landscape of the city. And I think that is in itself an interesting point you made too. It's not just something for the Squamish Nation, but it's something for Vancouver. And there's sort of an interplay there. I like the point you brought up, Chiyi, of like, you know, well, what it got me thinking about was just, should we treat different developers differently? That makes sense. I feel like the planning profession is often tries to be really agnostic about who's coming forward with an application, even though they might have very different intentions with what they do with that project, right? Someone who is a for-profit developer might want to buy their next yacht. I don't know. Sorry if there's developers in the room, but if it's a community land trust or if it's a different sort of group, should we as a profession, I say we, I'm a content creator, but should the profession, you know, sort of treat that differently? You know, I wonder if that's something that is, a topic for the next 30 years.
Short answer, yes. I think we are seeing some of this coming about, though, particularly with understanding for the community organizations, the not-for-profit organizations, the Indigenous housing providers, the support that is needed in order to get development for their community to happen. Like the scale of Sanok is amazing that you've been able to, I think it's going to be, 6,000 units in the end, to build that at that scale and have the support in the end of the municipality, the province to get there. That was a huge, huge amount of work. We're seeing that, in Ontario, I'd say in a smaller scale, and like little steps happening, and hopefully over the next 30 years, we'll see a bigger shift. But in some ways, I'm kind of seeing, in our work with, we work with some Indigenous housing providers to help them build affordable housing for their communities. It'll be, we're in a project that's 5+ years down the road to build 50 units somewhere in Scarborough. It's taken a long time to find, the capital, the support, the funding to make that development happen. But what has made it happen is really invoking on reconciliation to get government agencies to donate land and, skirt the requirements for selling at fair market value by finding ways to do, unique partnerships between like a school board and a municipality to trade land, for example, to find a way to donate this land to the Indigenous housing provider who is, this is originally their land and they're trying to build more homes for their community. And we're finding that there's more openness to finding ways to make this work now. And it's little baby steps. This is, a 40, 50 something unit development, but it's happening here and there. And I feel like, John, you may have something to add to that and what you're seeing in Mississauga as well.
Yeah, I completely agree. It's early days, and just before we came up here, we were talking about it. Very similar, and Jonah and I were chatting about the fact that, you look at the history, Jonah, you talked about how the land in Kitsilano was taken away in 1903, and I was talking about how the treaties on the lands in which we're currently sitting were signed over a century before that. And Pam Palmister, who's a professor at TMU and an outspoken Indigenous advocate, with a great podcast for those that love podcasts called Warrior Life Podcast. One of her very first episodes, and it's one that I reference all the time, and it's about Indigenous erasure in the GTHA. And when you look at major metropolitan areas all across Canada, the GTHA is the only one that doesn't have a reserve in it. Now, Six Nations and Mississaugas of the Credit are now about a 20-minute drive from the border of Hamilton, depending on traffic. But from here, it's about 90 minutes to the closest reserve. There was, and originally, the Mississaugas of the Credit had a reserve right in Mississauga, ironically underneath what is currently a golf course. And when I say underneath, it's still there. The ancestors are still there. And it was set up for them by the government in 1826. And then in 1847, they had cornered the market on shipping on the Credit River and were outperforming the two closest villages by a factor of about 2 to 1. So the villages got together and said, this won't do, and convinced the colonial government of its time to force the Mississaugas out. So economic prosperity wasn't for Indigenous peoples on their own land. And it was part of the erasure that happened across the better part of Southern Ontario. But most obviously here in Toronto and the surrounding environments and the surrounding regions. So there's a difference in perception when you're talking about property and ownership about who owns the land here. And, you know, I think Jonah and I could probably talk for 6 days about treaties and ceded versus unceded. And these are all terms that are now become very mainstream in the media in Canada. But they play a really important discussion point in all of this because one of the fascinating things that's really starting to happen is Ontario and BC are looking at each other, specifically in a land planning context, and BC's saying, wow, it must be so much nicer in Ontario where everything's treated. So, you know, there's a process in place on how to deal with reconciliation and so forth. And I can tell you, as somebody that has to do this day in and day out, there is no process. You know, and moreover, the treaties were seen as a bill of sale, and that's not what they were. You know, I've had the pleasure of actually physically going to the archives and digging out the treaties, and they're all still there. These are legal documents foundational to the creation of Canada, creation to the ability for the millions of people that live in this area to have a home and reside here. And that's foundationally what the treaties are. The very first treaty that was ever exchanged in North America is called the Two-Row Wampum. And the Two-Row Wampum is a very simple thing. It symbolizes two rivers, one by the settlers, the other for the Indigenous peoples, and it's two stripes that go along the belt. And it symbolizes the fact that we're all traveling together, but we shouldn't be impacting each other. You know, and at its core, that was the premise by which settlers were welcomed within North America, Turtle Island. So, and that's widely, very easily, you know, we could talk about this forever, that it's all been forgotten about. But, so when we're looking at land planning and saying, you know, when you're working within a treaty environment, there is a process. It is lengthy. And it's about getting that return on the lands which were given over for settlement. There are land claims that are happening. There was a land claim here in Toronto for the Toronto Islands back about 20 years ago. And there's land claims happening now within the city of Mississauga. And it's a very interesting thing because the very first thing everybody talks about is, am I going to lose my house? That's not the point. That's never the point. The point is saying, you were given permission to build that house on somebody else's land, and then it was sold from them. What is worth it? What are they going to get in terms of that economic value since that land was taken away from them? And it's really just that simple. And it's become, you know, you bring up the Cowichan decision, and I feel that's become a real flashpoint and a trigger, specifically because, at least here in Ontario, but I think all over North America, we're having this constant conversation about housing affordability and so forth, and about saying, so, you know, the concern is saying, is everybody seeing this in terms of those dollar signs and saying, there are so many ways land back and reconciliation can happen. It can be done through environmental stewardship. It can be done through joint ventures, like we're seeing, you know, out in BC and so forth. So it doesn't have to be this focus on land valuation and saying, you know, what's this going to do in terms of affecting the value of the house and so forth. And I think that's another thing to move into the next 30 years is moving beyond this concept of how much should a parcel of land cost. You know, I personally I cringe every time we're in any kind of meeting or discussion and they talk about economic value of land and so forth, and going, yes, I understand that principle, yes, I understand it, but it needs to move on. You know, we need to continue thinking about other ways that we value land.
I really appreciate you bringing up your last point there, because that was, you know, sort of my follow-up question to this talk around reconciliation was really, you know, there's kind of emerged in my view, a real pushback to reconciliation in recent years because of this Kyoto decision. And John, I really appreciate you adding some color to how we can interpret what that means. I'm curious if panelists have other thoughts or questions on that point, and if I can sort of reframe the question, like how do we bring, you know, those sort of concerned voices on side, or how do you communicate what this all means to people who might think, hey, like, am I about to lose my land over this? Is Canada about to become bankrupt over its, you know, commitments to, you know, all of these treaties or treaties it didn't sign? I'd be very curious for your perspectives on that. Which mic?
Raise your hand if you know what we're talking about. If you've heard about the Cowichan decision over fee simple land title and simultaneous title. Have you heard that? Okay, so it's actually not the majority of the room, so it's worth just giving a tiny briefer. TLDR, a high court said, yeah, you can have fee simple land property ownership, but there is simultaneous title because the land is unceded or et cetera, and prior agreements exist with the First Nations literally there. And it's like, it's coming out of the West Coast. And then immediately afterwards, there was, again, a firestorm, not dissimilar to the firestorm reaction to Sanok's development application. Sorry, I correct myself, you guys didn't have to make a development application, which was the significance of it, and had full jurisdiction to make that approval internally. So this caused a panic. This caused a massive panic, and let me offer both my BC hat and also my Chinese Canadian property trauma hat. I don't know if you've also heard the statistic that Chinese Canadians are over-indexed over most other Canadians for property ownership. This is like culturally a specific traumatized relationship to land and histories mostly of migration that come from being dispossessed from land that is then expressed into you better become a doctor and a lawyer and become a homeowner. Because the anxiety is from a very protective space. Everybody doesn't want to be forcibly removed from a place that they know. That is a universal truth. And so some people's natural conclusion is, we need to buy land. That is a very logical conclusion because we live in the capitalist property market system. I am saying we are the people in this room and our colleagues that would have the abundance of skills to dare to do the imagination work, to heal our basic ability to imagine a world not just where private property doesn't exist and to not panic at that, but to imagine that there is a path for you to walk in parallel. I think when I have the most conversations with rooms full of settlers that are mostly, or sometimes there is not a single Indigenous person in the room and we're talking about land back, what I honestly hear in those spaces is because we have not healed our ability to understand the word land, and because we are speaking in English, there are very few ways to directly translate all of the knowledge and teaching we are learning from people who are so generous to tell us what the word capital L land truly means. So when they hear land back, they hear property back, and you panic in the reaction to a Cowichan decision. You think that, oh, you're coming for my shit. Because the system you learned this property system under, that is the history. You took all of their shit. And so the only possible way you can imagine the outcome of that decision impacting your life is somebody's coming for my shit. That's not true. There is not a single indigenous First Nation anywhere, coast to coast, that I have ever heard that has said, I'm coming for your shit. It's just
Jonah,
saying
is that true? Are you coming for?
Is that an official
okay.
PR statement from the Squamish Nation? Okay. But like, literally no one has said this. This is a conclusion that settlers have panicked and jumped to on their own accord because you're so traumatized with this relationship to land through only learning it through property ownership. So what would be the next thing? And I know that, again, to some, that sounds like an insane question to ask. But I truly, truly want to invite the level of confidence and like knowledge from our specific profession to be able to use all of our creativity to sit with that. And I think, actually, it's a business professor out from the West Coast. I think she teaches at SUVU. She studies, I think, Squamish Nation's like historical economy. She came and did a workshop with our land trust once. And one thing she said in our workshop about our relationship to land and property was, I think one of the first things that is destroyed within you internally as one person living under capitalism is your ability to do imagination. There are very few professions besides architecture and engineering that repeatedly force us to exercise that muscle and skill. Artists do it, but there are very few other people who are trying to pay their bills, make rent, pay off their student loans, and work their gig work outside of their 9-to-5 job that is actually able to have the time and space to sit and think about what was I so nerdy about that made me apply to policy school or urban planning school in the first place, and how can I actually build the worlds that I want to build. That requires a basic healing of the ability to imagine, which this economy is not letting you do that because you are trying to pay a bill. So when I say land back, nobody should hear property back. We should be like, oh, there's a cool, exciting thing there for us to like noodle about together. We don't know exactly what that's going to look like. There is no definition for what land back is. I come from like a settlement and treaty context where the Nanjing Treaty gave away the entire port city of Hong Kong to the British. And the unequal treaty there was so specific, but we did not experience settler colonialism the way that I see it enacted here. And that clarity comes from going back into my own history with land and like our cultural understanding of treaties. And so it's a global conversation. It's not something that's like weirdly awkward and specific to the whole land acknowledgement dynamic that we have in Canada. I really want to invite that confidence from the room. Again, please tell me to shut the fuck up if any of you guys, you have the absolute right to as a
No, it's great. It's amazing.
Yeah. Jonah, do you want to have the last word on this question? Just how do we bring along
It's like,
people
how do you follow that, you know?
I was going to say, Chiyi, somehow you answered that
just,
question by like
getting mad at
healing my
everyone.
childhood trauma.
Yeah.
And I'm so here for it. But anyways, go
Well, just like to segue off that, I guess, I don't even know where you left off.
we have to use our imagination.
Yes,
but you know, I
exactly.
mean, kind of going back to it, I'm sure, you know, as your nation was developing Sanok, you hear all this controversy around it. And as, you know, more and more of these decisions, land decisions get made, I think, you know, John is correct. Like there has been a bit of a firestorm of controversies, perhaps some of it, you know, what's the word? Well-intentioned or some of it not well-intentioned. But I'm kind of curious, like, how do you think about engaging with those sorts of voices and perspectives?
I mean, I see it on both sides, and the really personal side of it's like, with Sanok in specific, is we're creating homes, right? And we're not a big development company where we're all going to be driving around in nice cars and going on planes and all these X, Y, and Z. All these monies, they all go back to our peoples. Everything goes back to our people to redevelop, to pay for post-secondary, and like to increase our availability to be more sustainable in the economy. And I feel like the biggest part of that too is upholding one another. And when you have these big shifts politically, especially in BC, it's hard to do that. And that's kind of just how I see it, though. I see it in a way of how will it look in 50 years? I don't see it in like that. I see it how it benefits us as peoples. I don't know if that answers your question there.
It does. Okay, I have to have the awkward job now of segueing to my next question, which I have been told I think we have like 5 minutes for. Let's see if we can solve the housing crisis in 5 minutes, you guys. Well, let's see how we do. And Marissa, if you have to, pull us off stage, you do so. So yeah, obviously housing kind of been an issue in the planning profession, pretty much in every city for the last decade or so. And of course, we've largely depended on the private sector to provide housing in Canada throughout much of Canada's history, although I think we've had some exceptional moments to that. I think the choice of having people like yourself, Narm, or yourself, Chiyi, on this panel, I think is pretty telling as to what the committee wants us to explore for this question. So I'm kind of curious, like in your perspectives, what are the models we should be aware of outside of the private model that truly have the capacity and the imagination to, dare I say, solve the housing crisis?
Well, I'll start and then I'll pass it to Chiyi because I won't touch land banking and land trust because I know that's your area of expertise. But I think what I've been hearing from my fellow panelists today is in the next 30 years, we're really needing to think about what does the decommodification of housing really look like and how is that actually implemented in a practical and realistic kind of way. I think what we're seeing is that this market growth-driven focus on housing hasn't led to affordability. There's no trickle-down effect. That's not happening. So how can we meaningfully provide housing across the housing continuum for everyone who needs it, ensure that everyone has a safe, secure, affordable, adequate place to live? I think what we're trying to advocate for in our work is really looking at how can you have a people-driven and equity-based approach to building housing. And in the system that we're currently in, the way to achieve that now is partnerships, but how can we move beyond just doing partnerships and empower these communities and these groups to do it on their own? It's very difficult right now when the market's tough. It's really affecting the private sector in terms of market housing and the funding available to actually build affordable housing, which is the only way it can really be done right now, is the small pot. It sounds like a lot, but it doesn't go very far, and it's putting everyone in competition with each other in order to achieve that funding and be able to build the affordable housing. So thinking about ways that we can shift from these little one-offs, we're all trying to get this little bit of funding, partner with our municipality to build this affordable housing, to making that a way that it's actually achievable as a community and together. And one way that could happen is seeing a bigger government role in housing again. They used to build housing. They used to build 30% of the housing used to be government owned and ensuring that basic right of shelter to their communities. And they've just stepped back from that. Now everyone else is in competition trying to fill that role, but there's no coherent system to doing it. And I think there are some groups that are really trying to look at ways to achieve this and come up with new models. And I think with what she's doing with the Toronto Community, Chinatown Land Trust is amazing, and other land trusts to look at these alternative land stewardship models. So Chiyi, I'll pass it to you.
Co-op housing's great, CLTs are great. But also we should say governments are building, the governments that are responsible to their people are building. That's the Canadian government, and the municipalities are not. The Canadian municipalities are not. And yeah, I think anybody, CLTs operate in their own tiny little self-coherent way, accountable to community demand. And so if you are a decision maker that fundamentally feels deeply accountable to the working class, you would have to build housing. So CLTs, most people in planning don't know, are not a housing solution. CLTs are invented by Black civil rights organizers in the southern context of the United States to protect farmland for food sovereignty. So it's not, CLTs are a legal decision-making tool for governance and community decision-making in the absence of a government and decision-making structure that actually accurately reflects what people need every day as we are dying on the street. And so for the people who are impatient, they will start a CLT, and in this economy, if you start a CLT, all of your constituency and my membership that votes tells me my first priority needs to be to build housing. And so we've become housing developers and housing acquisition teams, But that isn't inherent to the CLT model. And so again, it returns to being an existential, the problem with housing is fundamentally an existential crisis about land again. And that's what we're discovering as our sector grows.
Well, I'm afraid we have to end on that cliffhanger because I've been informed that we are out of time. So everyone, can I get you to give a warm round of applause to our panelists tonight? Thank you so much for sharing your insights. And oh yeah, so well deserved. And I'm sure you'll have a lot of networking to do afterwards and catching up to do. But while you're doing all of that, I hope that our little chat has planted some seeds. And if there was an idea that you heard, something that made you feel something, made you feel that imaginative spirit again for the first time in our very jaded lives, I hope you hold on to that and think about it, maybe bring it up in your conversation. Thank you so much again for having me. Try my best to moderate this panel, and I hope you just enjoy the rest of your evening.
Sorry. Yep. Just 3 things before we go back to networking. First, we have our 2 very talented artists creating their artwork along when we are having our panelist discussion. So come up and check out their artwork. Second, we are also running a bunch of donation campaign for our scholarships to help students fund their scholarship. If you're interested in donating, our QR code will be circulating shortly, and just scan the QR code and donate. And last thing, just go enjoy the night. Okay, thank you everybody for coming. Enjoy your night.